Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. You're very welcome to the City Lab. I hope that you will stay with us for the next 15 minutes or so for this Urban Futures session. Today, this session will feature some really big thinkers who will be providing some predictions for the future of our urban world post COVID-19. I'd like to introduce our esteemed guests. We have Sir David Adjaye, who is the principal of Adjaye Associates in Accra, London, and New York. We also will have Carlo Ratti, who's the founder of Carlo Ratti Associati and also the director of the Sensible Cities Lab in MIT. And finally, we will have Reuben Abraham, who is the CEO of the IDFC Foundation and IDFC Institute in Mumbai in India. The pandemic has exacerbated everything from economic to digital inequality. And what I'd like to hear from all of our panelists is, what do you think this will mean for urban life? Is there a bright side? And what do you think is the one big trend that you predict will shape urban life in the future? So maybe if I start with Reuben in that regard, perhaps you can tell us from your perspective, particularly drawn on the example of Indian cities.
I just want to establish from the get-go that a lot of the possibilities that are being discussed in the West, for instance, remote learning or remote working and so on, are just not feasible in the developing world. So the number of people, say, in India who can actually do remote work, I would be surprised if that number is more than 2% of the population, right? So for the vast majority of the population, we need to find a way for them to get back to work. We need to find a way for children to get back to schools, because currently children are trying to do remote learning on a 2G connection by and large. You know, my child is the lucky one who has a broadband connection at home and so on and so forth. So I think some of these things that very often get discussed in the West actually have no salience in the developing world. So seen from my perspective, I really am looking forward to getting back to normal so that the vast majority of my countrymen can actually get back to a life, start earning incomes again, and children don't see their lives destroyed.
Thank you, Reuben. So, David, you have operations from Accra to London to New York. What do you think?
I think that Reuben has made a very important distinction, which I think is going to underlie all our conversations. But I think that what is clear is that in terms of policy and planning and in terms of the way in which we produce buildings, we have now realized that some of the sort of existence minimums that we've been setting for housing, for offices, all these things are now going to have to shift. We realize that we're going to have to create a much better relationship to the biophilic world, to the natural world, to have breakout spaces, to have flexible spaces. And I think in housing, we're going to have to start thinking about, the luxury of the extra room, which was, the library or something else in a kind of in an affluent home, is now suddenly becoming a very functional thing. That it might be that we need to start thinking about sort of the box room that becomes a little library or a little office if there's an emergency, and that is becoming something that a lot of people are talking about as adding to the kind of way in which we make existence minimums for people. But also this idea that, you can make housing without balconies and outdoor spaces completely off the table now.
Carlo, do you share the optimistic perspective?
Yeah, I would say, thanks, Alice. I would say I totally share it. And I also share it for another reason. Well, first of all, last summer when I traveled a little bit, I went to Europe, I saw so much pent-up demand for being together, for public space, for the space of the city. And the other reason I'm optimistic is that public space is one of the few antidotes we have to the extreme polarization we get when we only connect online. When we only connect online, we tend to meet with people who are very similar to us. We can try to fend off diversity. We avoid everything that could actually challenge our comfort zone. Actually, public space, or even for that matter, the space of an office, is a space where we continuously need to negotiate diversity and other people, other ideas, other opinion. But that's a good thing. It's actually what can help us. First of all, again, to not to segregate ourselves, but also it helps creativity. It's about different points of view coming together. And so I'm pretty sure that physical space will have a surprising renaissance after the pandemic. I think all of those kind of doom and gloom prophets who said this is the end of the city will be proven wrong.
Let's hope so. David, I'd love to hear from you about how space has changed since the onset of the pandemic and the implications that you think that that will have for our offices and our homes in the future.
There's been a huge heightened sense of what is the space of the home? You know, if you're lucky enough to be able to think about that and you have the ability to think about that, you know, it's amazing the amount of people that are now putting plants everywhere, that are doing home urban farms, you know, little tomatoes growing on the window porch or seasoning and all the little things that, you know, we were seen as luxuries and nobody had time to deal with are all suddenly part of the way in which we set up the architecture that makes the home feel much more like a place that we can stay in. I think that we've realized the deficit of our private spaces. And I think that offices now are also realizing that it's not just about big boxes with lights, you know, vast spaces, but you need much more breakout space. You need a differentiated experience. You need inside outside space. And I think this is all very, very healthy. And as Carla was saying, also, we now prize where you have cities that have outdoor public space that's well made. That has now become the treasure that people, you know, are now completely, you know, addicted to. You know, if you took for granted a park, well, now you realize that it's a very important part of the quality of life that you have in the city. So I think that you're going to hear a lot of demand for better quality public spaces in the developing world. I think that that's become very clear. That, you know, there's just not, you know, the street is not enough as the public life of the city, that you need to do much, much more. And so I think that, you know, hopefully this pandemic, as Paolo was saying, I think is going to really kickstart a sense of really valuing the quality of our spaces and our environment.
David, something you're really well known, and I suppose one of your largest projects is designing the National African American Museum in Washington, D.C. And of course, you know, that's a very different type of space. It's a social public space. What implications do you think will the pandemic have for those kinds of spaces in the future?
No, I think that, you know, the National Museum of African American History and Culture is really the sort of new prototype of what a museum is in the 21st century. It's no longer just about being a sort of encyclopedia of objects that you sort of meander through. It's not about rooms, it's about experiences. So what the museum has sort of successfully done is to turn stories into experiences, spatial experiences and journeys. And I think that what has, even during this pandemic, what's made it, you know, very successful is that you're able to take very specific tours. They're like curated tours that take you through it. They're digitally very enhanced and capable of supporting the narrative and really enhancing the experience. And so you're able to also move people directionally much, much better, because you haven't got a sort of, as it were, rambling palace, but you've got these kind of curated paths. And I think that you're going to see a lot more of that, only because also we live in a world where the narrative is actually as important as the artifact, in the sense that people's stories and the lives of people are also profoundly important, and it's not always about the artifact of the time. Those are also important. And so finding ways in which narrative can become part of the experience of teaching and edifying society is, I think, going to become a very important addition to the arsenal of the quality of cultural life that we have. Not only can we go and see beautiful things about our past and our history, but we're also going to want to know about the lessons learned, movements that have happened. What do we learn from these things? How do they teach us about being better citizens and how we be in the world? And I think that the cultural sector is going to have to take on much more of this edifying role, which they did in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. In the 20th century, you know, we became a little bit more kind of hung up on the value of objects and the exclusivity. And I think now we're going to move into a world where we want to really, again, teach and learn lessons and understand how to make better citizens in the world. And the cultural sector is very much part of that.
Thank you for that, David. Carlo, you've been doing some very recent research in MIT, looking at the implications of us working online in terms of how we communicate and the impact that will have economically, socially, and indeed from an innovation perspective. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about those findings? And indeed, if you think there's any sort of long-term trends that we should be drawing from that research?
This is something that adds to the body of evidence and to what we were saying before, that we need to go back to physical space. And so let me tell you, just before the pandemic started, we were actually at MIT collecting data about how people communicate, anonymized information about all of the emails of the communication network. And then you know what? You got almost the perfect sociological experiment. What is the difference of a condition when people meet both digitally and physically versus a condition where people can only do Zoom calls from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. or 24/7, so all day long. And then, I'll shorten some of the findings, but basically what we are seeing is that because of that, our social networks are becoming weaker. Because of that, we are losing what sociologists call weak ties. Weak ties are very important. Weak ties are not the friends of our friends, our closely knit community of people we know very well. Weak ties usually are bridges to another group of people. And weak ties are, as sociologists found many years ago, there's a seminal work by Mark Granovetter in 1973 that looked at that. The paper is actually called The Strength of Weak Ties. So weak ties are very important for our social networks. And well, what we're seeing is that because of the pandemic, weak ties seem to become even weaker. So somehow that's another reason why we think that we need to go back to physical space, because that's really where we can nurture our networks. That's the place where we bump into somebody we're not expecting to meet. It's not somebody we schedule a Zoom call with, but then, we bump into her or him at a cafe, in the office, somewhere else, and then we have a coffee. And there you might discover new ideas, sometimes, random ideas that are far from our universe and might change our future lives. So again, one reason more to really value and nurture and go back to physical space.
So I guess you're saying those informal connections that we have at the water cooler or the coffee machine allow us to break down our silos. So do you believe that we will go back to work life as normal because we need to break down those silos to innovate, or will we adopt to a more hybrid model?
No, I think, as we were saying before, we needed to think about this kind of new existence minimum. And at the same time, it's certainly not going to back to life as before. I think we're seeing a lot of people, who are saying that, we all enjoy the flexibility that comes with remote working. We can spend that extra day in the countryside. We can, working from home. We don't need to commute during rush hours. We can actually commute a bit later. So, that's good for us and it's good for the city. We're also using the city in a better way. So I think, some people talk about 2+3, 2 days of home working, 3 days of working in the office. Other people, 50-50 or whatever the balance will be. I think that, we'll keep some of that. And then it's very, very important that the time we spend in the office then has more impact on our social networks. So again, it goes back to David's point and how we can design our offices in a different way so they become social condensers. They can help us accelerate those processes.
Very interesting. Ruben, just to return to where we started off hearing the perspective of Indian cities. And I think one of the remarkable things you were saying was the situation is so incredibly different in India, for example, to maybe a city in the United States. And also in that context, I just want to quote you. You said that the pandemic could be a turning point in India's urban journey if we draw the right lessons. What are the right lessons for Indian cities?
So I think it's not just an Indian city problem. So this is a big distinction we need to draw, which is between crowding and density. And the pandemic has the infection rates go up dramatically if you get crowding. And this has been true whether you're looking at New York or you look at Singapore or you look at Mumbai, it's the same story. So how do you basically reduce crowding? And the answer to that actually lies in land management. It lies in removing supply side constraints to affordable housing, for instance. It lies in thinking through zoning restrictions, FSI restrictions, and so on and so forth. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is social protection. By and large, in a country like India, has always had a rural bias, because the assumption was that if you live in a city, you are part of social networks and you have social capital, except what happens when you're a new migrant, you've lost your job and your benefits are tied to where you've come from. What you see is what you saw in India, which is millions of migrants start to walk home. So I think that really showed that the emperor had no clothes in that sense. So you really need to start thinking about social protection in urban areas. And then one sort of last thing, because we're running out of time, is is there a way for us to embed the good behaviors that we have learned during COVID? So just to give you some quick data points here, one of the things we discovered in a city like Mumbai is that gastroenteritic diseases, so things like cholera, typhoid, etc., has dipped like crazy in 2020 because hygiene practices that were put into place to deal with COVID has had this positive effect on gastroenteritic diseases. Similarly, mask wearing has a immediate effect on tuberculosis. And just to give you perspective on tuberculosis, TB kills 1,400 people a day in India. That's about 500,000 people die of tuberculosis. So if there was a way to embed mask wearing as a behavior anytime you're in a crowded space, that could have an effect on, say, tuberculosis, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a bunch of behaviors here that if we do the right thing, I think we could actually see a very positive kind of turnaround in the fate of cities across the developing world.
And just to summarize, if we are to see lasting changes for cities in the global south, what exactly would you advise city governments to focus on?
So, I mean, I think right now it's all the things that I mentioned. And the other thing, hopefully coming from COVID, is to very seriously now think in terms of risk management. And risk management, not just in terms of pandemics, but risk management in terms of climate change and so on and so forth. See, when you talk about risk management, you quickly realize that a lot of it is actually related to organizational design. So how do you embed the thinking around risk management into organizations, into government, into the corporate sector, and so on? Again, COVID provides you the opportunity, because if you said the same thing, 2 years ago, nobody would have listened to you. But today, they're likely to listen to you. And that then has an effect for the disasters that would come from climate change, for instance, and so on and so forth. So again, I tend to take a very kind of positive view on this. Yes, it's been a disaster for all of us, but if we do the right thing now, I think net, we end up with a positive outcome.
Completely agree. I think COVID-19 has managed to shine a light on many of the inequalities that already existed in our cities for a long time, and there's a real opportunity to address them in terms of delivering a just recovery. So thank you very much to David and to Ruben and to Carlo. Thank you, everyone.